what we've seen in Britain in recent weeks has been the installation of a new monarch. Not a coronation yet. That'll happen next year in May. King Charles III. Now, when I say that, Beryl, King Charles III, I'm irresistibly drawn to say King Charles Spaniel instead. But I didn't say that time, so that's good. But it's interesting, isn't it, about the monarchy, the way that we have it at the moment. You have the next in line, the person who's going to be the king or queen, being the son or, nowadays it's son or daughter of monarch. Has this process come to an end? A big question being, is the heir and the spare fair? Is it a fair way to run things? So just bring me and our listeners up to date on what is this little phrase that I borrowed from you, the heir and the spare. Where does that come from? What does it mean by that?
What we mean by the heir and the spare is, in days gone by, talking hundreds of years ago, it was by no means certain that the heir to the throne would actually accede to the throne, because life was so fragile and it was necessary to have several children to make sure that one of them would actually ascend to the throne. Remembering, of course, that hundreds of years ago it was only males who were allowed to ascend to the throne. Yeah,
only males, unless there weren't any males left. Well, so that's sort of how we had a queen.
Yes, that's
was
true.
A queen.
Yes.
It wasn't that she was the eldest, purely. It was that there weren't any sons.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thinking about Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Anne, of course.
Yes, Queen Victoria.
But these days, life is much more certain. It would be unusual for the heir to the throne to die of some illness or something like that, because our medical knowledge and expertise has grown so much. And it wouldn't be usual for a second in line to the throne, the second in the line of succession, to ascend to the throne. The other thing is, of course, that we don't have the kind of wars nowadays where children of the monarch are sent into battle.
No.
They no longer...
an heir and a spare, the idea is that you as king, you have to have two children, and in the past it would have to be two males, because you've got your heir, who is the person who will take over from you when you die, but you need a spare in case that one gets killed off. That's the idea of the heir and the spare. And in a modern context, you'll say, well, it's not really necessary, but this comes to importance to the general public, because in Britain, at least, you can enlighten me, as our royal correspondent, Beryl, you enlighten me, but in Britain, certainly, we pay, as in the public pay through Parliament, pay for our monarchy. There's actually a grant given to the king, and also to other members of the royal family, as he deems fit. Actually, it's up to him, I believe, who will be part of this grant. So at the moment, he would be paid, as would the heir and the spare.
Well, that has been the case, yes.
So is that the issue you're looking at? I mean, is it the case that, in fact, we don't need to pay for the spare because we've got an heir? Is that what you're talking about? Should it not be part of the funds that we disperse to the monarchy?
Well, there is still a danger. In Queen Elizabeth II's reign, she actually tried to make sure that the spare did not travel with the heir on an aeroplane. For example, William is now heir to the throne, and she wasn't happy about William's son George travelling on the plane with his father. But of course, a father would say, while the child is still underage, I'm the father. They need to travel with me, not in a separate vehicle.
Yes, I can see that. But the heir and the spare idea only works until your heir has children of his own, and then he needs an heir and a spare, right? Because it passes down through the line.
That's right, absolutely.
So while the children of Queen Elizabeth were young, she would need the heir and the spare would, in fact, in those days, because women didn't inherit the throne if there were any sons, it would have been Charles and Andrew.
That's correct.
The next one in line would be Andrew. But then when he had children, of course, the first child being William, it passed to William.
Although Andrew had two daughters, so of course that would cause a problem.
But when did he change? He changed so that women were counted in the normal line.
Around about 2012, 2013.
Oh, right. So Princess Anne, who was the second child of Queen Elizabeth, she was never second in line.
No,
because by the time it was changed,
it came into effect with Princess Charlotte.
Okay, so now Princess Charlotte, who is the second child of William, and
That's
so
correct.
now is a third in line after
There's now
George.
Prince Louis after her.
And then Prince Louis. Then it goes to Harry.
Yes, that's
So he's
correct.
still sort of a spare.
Yes.
He's sort of a spare part still.
Yes,
in
but
that
he
he's-
has to go through 3 others.
Now, is this process in place anywhere else in the world? Are there other royal families in a similar situation where
Other
they
royal
inherit it like
families
that?
are in a similar situation. In fact, I'm thinking now of the country of Denmark, where Queen Margrethe is queen, and she has 2 sons.
An heir and a spare.
Yes, an heir and a spare. Frederick is the heir, and Joachim is the spare.
Okay, yeah.
But they are far more grown than William and Harry.
Okay.
They are older, and
But
they've both got families of their own.
So the line of succession there would be Margarita, then her first son, Frederick, and then his first child.
His first child, which I believe is Nikolai.
Okay, so in this case, Nikolai is the one who's second in line to the throne.
Yes.
So that's the succession. So presumably they need to be paid for. Certainly they would need security.
And they've so far been termed, those siblings of Nikolai and so on, they've all been named prince or princess according to their sex.
Now, going back to Britain, where within the traditions of the country and explicitly stated in, for example, the coronation service, part of our constitution, that the monarch, king or queen, is head of the country and also supreme governor of the Church of England. But in both roles, secular and religious, they're seen as being put in place by God. They're
Yes.
under Christ. So in that way, it's an interesting question as to how they are appointed, because if you look at it from a spiritual point of view, if God is appointing them by the means of the children being born, do you believe that primogeniture, the firstborn? Yeah. So that being the case, when they're born, is God particularly, specifically creating someone with the right characteristics? How do you think it works? Or is it like a spiritual formation, as they become king or queen, God gives them the gifts necessary? How do you think that works? We specifically state and we pray for the king as being leader of religion in this country, leader of the church, and a sort of a head of the country in a spiritual sense. Not that we believe that he speaks for God, but rather the opposite way round, that it puts the country under the kingship of Christ. It's the opposite of what it might think at a superficial level. But if that being the case, we need someone who believes in Christ, who sees themselves as under his authority, and the king has publicly stated that he's in line with that. And in the first sermon, as when he was king by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the king was reminded that he had this same view as being as serving under Christ as his mother had. So it looks like he does believe that. But in choosing him, does God have the right person born for the role, or does he fill him with his spirit so he's equipped for this role?
Some might question what I'm going to say next, but the king being the firstborn, suppose there was some freak of nature and a son was born who wasn't capable of exercising kingship.
Well, God would have control over that, wouldn't he?
He would.
Yeah. What would happen?
I think actually what would happen is that the next son in line, daughter in line, would become regent for him.
Okay, so he would be technically king, but someone else... Is a regent actually king?
No,
Oh, right,
I don't think so.
They're king in place of someone who's technically king?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
And they hold the reins of government, while the person who is incapable of ruling holds the title in name only.
Right. It then becomes a question of how is God sovereign, isn't it? I mean, I tend towards the idea that there's a mix of it. God does give you unnatural abilities in the first place, but when you have a particular task, you are filled with the Spirit. If God is calling to a particular task and you're open to this, God will fill you with his Spirit, giving you specific gifts to carry out that task. We see in the Bible, in the book of Acts, we see the Apostle Paul being sent out on his missionary work each time he's prayed to be baptised with the Spirit, or people lay on hands to be baptised with the Spirit, and it notes in the Bible he's filled with the Spirit for this particular task, for this role. And so becoming king, you would expect that God would want to do that. And indeed, in the service of coronation, there's a moment when that's meant to happen, symbolising it happen.
Talk about the madness of King George.
Concluding my thought, what happens in the coronation service, or what is symbolised in the coronation service, when the new monarch goes to the altar and presents themselves to God? I believe then they are filled with the Spirit, or that's what's been symbolised there. And the Archbishop of Canterbury referred to that in his sermon of the Queen doing that in her coronation. So
I think that's a particular Anglican understanding.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'm not sure that I agree with it.
Okay, yeah.
But my angle was more about what role does God have for the spare and the extra spares.
So what you're saying is, if God has ordained that this particular person is king, or once they become king, God fills them with the Spirit, however we look at it, what about the next in line? What about the heir and the spare?
Well, and other children as well.
Yeah.
Is it fair that the monarch has to support his brothers and sisters, and what should their role be?
That's a good question, because even if you have the king being appointed effectively by God, but practically by other means, that doesn't mean that the next in line is, because they may not be the next in line. So what about the spare, as you say?
Yes. And should they support the monarch while not being paid, or should they be able to disentangle themselves from the role of monarchy and go off and earn their own income?
Here I see that you're maybe thinking of Prince Harry has done.
Yes.
He was at one point the spare.
Yes, but I'm not only
But he's not
thinking
anymore.
of Prince Harry, because it's also come up in the country of Denmark.
Ah, right. So in Denmark there is...
Prince Joachim.
Right,
his
yes.
children have been disinherited from their titles of prince and princess, and they're not happy about it.
Right. Yes.
Because they can no longer be termed prince and princess, and they've now become mere counts and countesses.
But does that mean that they're not in line with the throne, them not being prince and princess?
Well, since Prince Frederick has 4 children, possibly more than that.
Well, if he's got 5 children, and he's first in line, so
Yes.
the last of his is 6th in line, then Joachim is 7th, so the first
That's
of his
correct.
children will be
Yes.
8th in line to the throne.
Yes.
But
which
still
is very
in line.
unlikely to
It's
be
very unlikely.
necessary.
Now, for Harry, it looks like that's happening as well, right?
Yes, he has now been displaced by 3. Prince George, Princess
he's
Charlotte,
been displaced
and
by
Prince Louis.
He's been displaced by the children. So now,
Yes.
where is he? Is he 6th or 5th? William is first, then 3 children are 5th, isn't he? Is that
Yes,
right? Yeah.
I would say so.
He's 5th in line.
His children.
His
fall
children.
in.
His children. Yeah. I'm unclear about this, because my understanding is he would still be in line to the throne. It's just that they're not regarded as princes and princesses because it's so distant.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So theoretically, if he somehow organised for them all to be killed, he could become king. Obviously, it'd have to be secret.
We're not going back to the princes in the
He
tower.
could lock them in the tower. Hopefully not. I'm not suggesting he does this. I think it may be easily found out. But that's interesting, isn't it? How it works in royalty means that you're worried about who's related to who or whatever. But just in closing, I mean, is this, with all its difficulties in seeing who's the next in line, is it actually a better process? Because it's more certain, anyway, than voting for people. Is it a better way of determining your leader? I mean, you have the continuity set up, you know who they're going to be. If, as you say, they're completely incapable, the procedures, you can have a regency instead. Maybe it's a better way of choosing than voting like we do for the Prime Minister.
Yes, well, seeing the shambles that we've got at the moment in this country, I'm sure some people would think it was a better way of achieving a monarch, having them by succession, as it were.
Yes, but in conclusion, what I hear you saying, Beryl, what do we think of this? And I think you were saying that really they don't need to be supported by the royal grant if these people are so distantly in line to the throne, because it's unlikely, with medical science being as it is, a safer society, not sending the heir and the spare to war, they're unlikely, if you're several removed down the line of succession, to be king or queen ever. So they shouldn't really be supported by the grant.
The country should let them go, allow them to earn their own income and be ordinary members
Be free,
of the public.
fly away. Yes, that's the advice of the Beryl and Pete show Let them go. Let them go.
Am I allowed to disagree?
Yes.
Question, is Norman allowed to disagree? Answers sent in on a postcard, please.
I don't think medical science is perfect, so therefore it is not impossible for the first child of the heir to have some mental disease that impairs their ability to be king. And I think you have to think about that one. It hasn't actually happened as such within our memory. I mean, I don't know. I just vaguely remember the title of the film, The Madness of King George. That goes back quite a lot. And if, as you say, God prepares somebody and looks after him and so on, as you say, Peter, with your view, then how do you account for the madness of King George, which actually crept up during his lifetime? And also, completely different point, we do depend upon these people as being patrons of, leaders of, etc. I mean, you mentioned Princess Anne, and she was quite a bit down the pecking order, and yet she herself was the patron of a regiment and was celebrated by the regiment. And people come and, like Prince Philip said, he was very, very good at unveiling statues and pictures and so on. So we do depend upon them to do things. And if we actually let them go, we would have no call upon them to come and open our official buildings or plant the official trees or whatever they actually do. Should society manage without official trees and buildings and plaques and so on?
Just speaking personally, I've never understood why you want a royal person to come and open something. I don't get it, I suppose. But it's in the same way in a church you ask a bishop to come and do something. Well, why are we doing that? I know people like it. I guess that's the reason. So there's a couple of points I made. One is just taking the exact point of King George III.
He suffered from porphyria.
The current theory is that, yes. But exactly how bad was he as king? In fact, the big loss that he had was it was during his reign that we lost the American colony, which became the United States. But that wasn't his fault. That was down to Lord North, who was Prime Minister at the time, and his cabinet making stupid decisions over taxation. It wasn't the king that did it. In fact, if you left it to the king, I think he would have made every effort to keep the colony, because he was very much in favour of it, and at least in the film, cried over the loss of the prairies. I doubt that really happened, but in the film about him, that's happened. One point is, I think, yes, royalty can be bad, but sometimes voted-in politicians can be worse. So,
yes.
In fact, I think one of the best arguments for democracy is that it is the worst of all possible political methods, apart from all the others. There isn't a perfect way of running your country, including having a king or queen. And in the Bible, God tries to dissuade his people from having a king or queen, and he fails because they still want one, so he gives them to him. And this is really my point to take in the second point. Even God himself directly wasn't able to manage a country politically without them going astray, because people do what they want. So if a king is chosen, or anyone is chosen and appointed and filled with the Spirit by God himself, they can still decide to go off the rails or just have their own selfish needs. So it's certainly no guarantee, and the sinfulness of humans means that we all fail in different ways.
Yes.
So you would expect that to happen.
I think we have to acknowledge that.
But I think, Beryl, your point about setting them free was people so far down the inheritance of kingship that really you can forget them these days. The other point of who gets employed to do royalty type stuff, the current King, King Charles III, has indicated that he thinks fewer people more appropriate. And he's also indicated that some of the seats in the coronation, the good seats, the posh seats where you can actually see what's going on, some of the aristocracy are going to be booted out, and he's going to have ordinary people come in.
Yes. Indeed.
That's what he said. So certainly there are changes in mind with the current king. Watch this space, but so far I've been quite impressed with the way he's handling things.
Yes, I have too. Apparently there won't be so much fur and velvet at the next coronation.
Yes. I don't mind fur and velvet, but I get the idea, not quite so ostentatious. I think that probably would be a good idea, and actually would look better when things are so over the top.
Yes.
Maybe it's just modern sensibilities, but they tend to look a little ridiculous when it's too ornate.
Silly hats.
Yeah, I think you'd be better not wearing so many silly hats. I think it's true in church. If you have a traditional service, it still looks better if your bishop is not wearing a fancy mitre hat, because they just look ridiculous. Wear robes, but wear simple robes. I know it's just a style thing, and things will change, but style has so changed since the last coronation. It's certainly a good idea. I think that I agree with Charles's assessment of modern architecture. You know, he commented that some of the newer buildings in London were carbuncles.
Yes.
And he didn't like the sort of big brutalist, modernist sensibilities of a lot of the concrete jungle that we live in. However, I think he's right on the simplicity. Now, what happens in architecture is you take a cathedral, which in the past would have been brightly painted and massive statues, and you just have it in the plain white stone. To us, that looks better. In the past, it would have looked a bit boring.
I must say I like glass myself. How about a glass cathedral?
Okay. Yes. Yeah, that would be good. No throwing stones, though.
All transparent.
Greater transparency. That would be a good thing. Well, moving swiftly on, we're going to move on to our